They found him sitting in the cockpit, hands still gripping the controls, eyes locked straight ahead like he'd seen something no one should survive. The manifest in his pocket listed 7 passengers, but the helicopter was empty, the seats were clean, and his flight suit carried stains no one wanted to examine too closely. He didn't resist when they pulled him out, didn't flinch when they searched the aircraft. And when the base commander demanded to know where the other 7 were, he just stared through him, like the question didn't even register. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to Real Heroes Stories YouTube and hit like. The call came into Sentinel Ridge Airfield at 5:43 a.m. on a Tuesday morning when the high desert still held the cold breath of night. Sergeant Reese Tolliver had been Tower Watch Officer for 12 years. Long enough to recognize trouble before it announced itself. And when the Black Hawk materialized on his radar screen without warning, already inside the security perimeter and descending fast, his coffee went cold in his hand. No transponder code, no radio hail, no flight plan logged with any authority he had access to. Just the low mechanical thunder of rotor blades cutting through silence that shouldn't have been broken at this hour, in this place, under circumstances that violated every regulation written into the operational manual, sitting 3 feet from his elbow. He keyed his microphone twice, running through standard challenge protocol that every military pilot knew by heart. Static answered him. Empty frequency noise that suggested either equipment failure or deliberate radio silence, neither option comforting given the circumstances. He keyed again with emergency frequency override that should have triggered automatic response from any aircraft in controlled military airspace. Still nothing. Just that static and the growing sound of rotor wash as the helicopter continued its approach, smooth and deliberate, as if the pilot knew exactly where he was going and had no interest in asking permission. Tolliver's hand hovered over the red phone connecting directly to base security, but something made him hesitate. Some instinct honed over a decade of watching aircraft come and go. This wasn't hostile approach. The helicopter wasn't moving with aggressive maneuvering patterns that characterized incoming threats. It was coming in steady, controlled, almost gentle in descent profile. But it was also completely wrong in every other respect. And that wrongness sat in Tolliver's gut like a stone, growing heavier with each passing second. The Black Hawk touched down on the main tarmac with precision that spoke to thousands of flight hours logged across multiple aircraft types and operational environments. The rotors began winding down in perfect mechanical rhythm, following shutdown sequence that pilots performed so many times it became automatic even in crisis situations. But the usual post-flight activity never materialized. No doors opened to release crew members. No one emerged to perform standard inspection checks. No one moved to chock the wheels or secure the aircraft against desert wind that picked up unpredictably this time of morning. The helicopter just sat there, dark and silent and wrong, in a way that made Tolliver's training scream warnings his conscious mind was still trying to articulate. He made the call. Within 8 minutes, Colonel Marin Cross was pulling up to the flight line in a vehicle that still had engine heat. She stepped out wearing a uniform that remained crisp despite the early hour, her eyes already scanning the helicopter with the kind of focus that came from 3 combat deployments, where hesitation measured the difference between walking away and going home in a flag-draped box. She'd spent those tours in regions where trust was a luxury, afforded only to people who'd proven themselves multiple times under fire. And coincidences were usually ambushes wearing disguises thin enough to see through, if you knew what to look for. The unmarked helicopter sitting on her airfield in pre-dawn darkness hit every alarm bell that experience had installed. She approached with sidearm holstered but unsnapped, the 4-man security detail spreading out behind her in formation that provided coverage angles without clustering into vulnerable groupings. Her eyes tracked across the helicopter's exterior, looking for damage patterns, unusual modifications, anything providing context beyond obvious wrongness of unannounced arrival. Paint scheme was standard military issue, with no unit markings visible in growing light. No combat damage scarring the airframe. No modifications screaming special operations. Just a Black Hawk that looked exactly like 1,000 others, except it had landed on her base without authorization. The tail number came back clean when security ran it through the database. Active registry showing no maintenance flags. Current inspection logs indicating the helicopter had passed its most recent evaluation 3 weeks prior. Assigned to Joint Task Force operations out of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, with service history showing deployments to 4 different theaters over the past 8 years. Everything about the registry screamed legitimate military asset, operating under proper authority. But that just made it worse, because aircraft assigned to JTF didn't make unauthorized landings at remote desert installations. They followed protocols. They maintained communication. They didn't appear like ghosts and sit silent. Cross made the decision herself, waving security detail back to minimum safe distance while she moved forward alone. Her boots sounded loud against concrete in early morning stillness, each step deliberate as she circled the helicopter once in complete inspection loop. She noted dust patterns along lower fuselage, suggesting extended flight through desert environments. Hydraulic fluid stains near tail rotor assembly indicating recent stress on systems. Faint scent of aviation fuel hanging too heavy in air. Nothing overtly wrong in any individual detail, but cumulative weight of small wrongnesses adding up to something that made her hand drift closer to her sidearm. She reached the cockpit and looked inside through curved windscreen transparency. And that's when her training failed her for just a moment. The man sat perfectly still, hands locked on cyclic and collective controls in a grip that looked painful even from outside. His face was turned toward the horizon, as if still flying toward some destination only he could see. Eyes open but unfocused in the way that suggested his consciousness had departed somewhere his body couldn't follow. His uniform carried captain's rank insignia with aviation wings above name tape reading Brennan in faded block letters. His dog tags hung outside his collar, regulation violation that spoke to combat conditions or psychological breakdown. Cross suspected both. She tapped on cockpit glass with her knuckle, sharp sound that should have triggered instant response. Nothing happened. Not even a flicker of recognition. She tried the door handle, found it unlocked, pulled it open with slow deliberation of someone expecting either ambush or corpse. The pilot didn't move, didn't acknowledge her presence with even involuntary muscle responses, just continued staring at that invisible horizon while his hands maintained death grip on controls that no longer needed holding. Cross spoke his name using command voice that had moved soldiers across hostile territory and broken through combat shock more times than she cared to count. No response. She reached in carefully and checked his pulse at the throat, feeling steady beat confirming he was alive, even if his mind seemed elsewhere. His skin was cold despite warming morning air, and when she looked closer, she could see faint tremor running through his arms, involuntary contractions of someone who'd held the same position far too long. She stepped back and noticed the manifest folder protruding from the thigh pocket of his flight suit. Pulled it out with gloved hands, because every instinct was screaming this required evidence-handling protocols. She unfolded the papers under growing dawn light and felt the bottom drop out of her understanding. 7 names typed in neat rows. 7 passenger listings with seat assignments, all marked with classification codes she'd seen exactly twice in her entire career, the kind appearing only on missions that never made it into official records. Operations conducted in gray spaces between acknowledged military action and plausible deniability. These were codes used for extractions that couldn't be tracked, for movements of assets that couldn't be documented, for missions existing only in encrypted communications of people whose clearances went higher than organizational charts suggested possible. But the helicopter behind the pilot was empty. She could see straight through cargo bay to opposite door, morning light starting to penetrate interior and illuminate nothing except regulation seating and standard emergency equipment. No passengers. No cargo. No sign anyone, except the pilot, had ever been aboard. 7 names on paper. 0 bodies in reality. And one pilot who looked like he'd flown through hell without making it back out the other side. Cross made a decision that felt simultaneously necessary and potentially career-ending. She ordered the pilot removed and taken to Emergency Operations Center for immediate evaluation and interrogation. 2 airmen approached carefully, moving with caution of people briefed on the strangeness. They began extracting Brennan from cockpit, discovering his fingers had to be pried off controls one at a time because joints had locked from hours of sustained grip. When they finally got him free and helped him down to tarmac, his legs buckled once before he caught himself. Not from weakness, but from simple reality of standing after sitting too long. They walked him across airfield toward Operations Center, a low concrete building serving multiple purposes, including crisis management and interrogations requiring isolation. Brennan moved between airmen like a man in a dream, steps mechanical, gaze still fixed on something no one else could see. He didn't speak, didn't resist, didn't show any sign he registered where he was or what was happening beyond basic motor functions required to put one foot in front of the other. It was as if his consciousness had separated from his body somewhere over the Atlantic, and only autonomic functions remained. Major Lyle Kessler waited inside the interrogation room with patience of someone who'd spent 15 years extracting information from people who didn't want to provide it. He'd been intelligence officer at Sentinel Ridge for 4 years, long enough to develop reputation for getting results without crossing lines that turned interrogations into incidents requiring review boards. His methods relied on reading people rather than breaking them, understanding psychological breaking points and knowing when to push versus when to let silence work. Brennan sat in the chair without direction, movements still carrying that dreamlike quality. His hands settled on steel table automatically, palms flat, fingers spread in position that looked almost like supplication. His eyes finally shifted from that distant horizon to focus on table surface, studying it with intensity people reserved for objects holding meaning beyond physical properties. Kessler noted the tremor in his hands, now visible against solid surface. The way his breathing remained shallow and controlled in pattern, suggesting deliberate regulation rather than natural rhythm. The micro-expressions flickering across his face like fragments of thoughts that couldn't cohere. This wasn't a man refusing to cooperate. This was a man fundamentally broken by something and still trying to figure out which pieces remained functional. The interrogation began with basics: name, rank, service number, assignment. Questions pilots answered by reflex because information was so deeply encoded in training, it bypassed conscious thought. But Brennan's mouth didn't move. His eyes didn't shift to acknowledge Kessler's presence. He just continued staring at the table as if it contained answers to questions no one had thought to ask yet. Kessler tried again, adjusting tone, softening approach, switching to voice used for trauma victims and people in shock. Still nothing. Not defiance. Not resistance. Just absence, as if the person who should have been answering had gone somewhere else and left only the shell behind. He pivoted to technical questions pilots answered reflexively because information lived in their hands and instincts. Fuel consumption rates, maximum flight ceiling, hydraulic pressure specs. The bread and butter of aviation knowledge every pilot carried like a second language. Brennan's expression didn't change. The tremor in his hands intensified slightly. Barely perceptible increase, Kessler noted, but didn't comment on. But while Kessler worked through systematically futile interrogation protocol, Tolliver sat in the tower, running deeper analysis on the helicopter's systems, pulling data from every sensor and logger, cross-referencing against databases tracking military flight patterns across every monitored airspace. What he found made him reach for the phone to cross before his conscious mind fully processed implications. The helicopter's internal chronometer showed continuous flight time of 11 hours and 43 minutes. Fuel consumption matched that duration perfectly. Engine temperature records confirmed sustained operation across that span. But GPS tracking told a story violating basic physics and geographical reality. The departure coordinates placed the aircraft in eastern Syria at 4 p.m. local time the previous day. Not on any official base, just numbers corresponding to a location 43 miles outside a town not appearing on standard maps, a region intelligence analysts referred to in careful language as suspected black site territory. The flight path to Sentinel Ridge should have been impossible without multiple refueling stops, should have crossed airspace belonging to hostile nations, should have triggered air defenses in 5 countries. But GPS showed continuous line. No stops, no deviations. Straight shot across the Mediterranean, across the Atlantic, across the continental United States, to the remote desert installation, where it had touched down at 5:43 a.m. Mountain Time. Blackhawk fuel capacity couldn't support that range. Speed required to cover that distance exceeded maximum velocity significantly. The entire flight profile existed in mathematically impossible territory. Yet the helicopter sat on tarmac, and data logs insisted this impossible flight had occurred exactly as recorded. Tolliver forwarded complete analysis to Cross with priority flag bypassing normal protocols. She read it standing in hallway outside interrogation room, expression shifting from confusion to grim understanding. This wasn't just unauthorized flight. This was an operation gone so catastrophically wrong that someone made the impossible happen, or one pilot pushed his aircraft beyond every limitation because alternatives were worse. She entered carrying the printed analysis, laid it before Brennan without words. The map showed Syria coordinates in red, flight path traced. Arrival marked at Sentinel Ridge. For the first time since extraction, Brennan's eyes moved. Just a slow shift from table to map, a flicker of recognition. His breathing changed, becoming more controlled, deliberate regulation preventing panic. His hands pressed harder against steel, fingers splaying wider. Cross placed the manifest beside the map. 7 names, 7 codes, 7 passengers who should have been aboard at landing. Where were they? The 7 who boarded at Syria coordinates. Where had they gone between departure and arrival? Brennan's tremor spread from hands to arms, his jaw clenched rhythmically, fighting for control. His eyes moved to wall behind Cross, fixing on blank surface. Then, so quietly recording equipment almost missed it, he spoke. One word, whispered like confession. Gone. The word hung like smoke, spreading to fill space with implications no one wanted to examine. Gone could mean many things. Cross and Kessler exchanged glances, communicating paragraphs without vocalization. This was the moment where situations either resolved or escalated into career-destroying incidents. Cross sat across from him, matched his posture, created non-threatening presence that let confession become possible. Minutes passed. 5, 10. Digital clock marking time while 3 people waited for something to break. Brennan's breathing gradually slowed. His hands stopped trembling quite so violently. His eyes came back from that distant point and settled in middle distance. And then, like a dam developing its first critical crack, he began to speak. Not in formal report language, but in halting fragments describing trauma too fresh for coherent narrative. The mission came through encrypted channels he'd used before, orders requiring multiple authorization layers. He'd flown black operations previously, missions appearing on no official logs. Syria coordinates pointed to isolated building, intelligence indicating high-value asset requiring extraction. 7 operators from unnamed unit boarded at staging area he couldn't disclose. Standard protocol for deniable operations. Flight into Syria was textbook. Low altitude, terrain following. Building exactly where intelligence placed it. 7 operators moved efficiently, clearing structure, securing the asset. Frightened but cooperative man in his 40s, returning within 4 minutes. Wheels up at 4:03 p.m. local. Clean extraction. No hostile contact. Perfect execution of a mission that should have been routine. The asset was secured in cargo bay, restrained professionally. 7 operators settled around him, weapons ready but not threatening. Brennan climbed to operational altitude, set course for first waypoint, allowed himself brief satisfaction. That moment lasted 47 seconds, which was how long it took for the asset to speak. He said they were expected. Hostile forces had known for 3 days. Intelligence was compromised from the start. Then the explosion hit. Not incoming fire. An IED buried under the landing zone with pressure release trigger, armed during touchdown, delayed by timer allowing altitude before detonation. The blast caught tail rotor, shockwave shattering hydraulic lines, shearing mounting bolts. The helicopter lurched violently. Brennan fought it. Hands moving faster than conscious thought, making corrections from 10,000 flight hours, keeping them airborne through skill and desperation. Operators had been thrown against bulkheads, but maintained discipline, securing themselves while assessing damage. They'd trained for this. But the asset revealed his second surprise. Jacket opened, showing device strapped to chest. Chemical dispersal system. Dead man's switch in hand. Constant pressure keeping mechanism from releasing payload. If he let go, lost consciousness, got shot, device would activate automatically. Bait in a trap designed to eliminate these specific operators. The payload was aerosol neurotoxin, designed for enclosed spaces, engineered for respiratory failure and hemorrhagic tissue breakdown within minutes. Cargo bay represented optimal dispersal environment. Operators couldn't shoot without triggering it, couldn't restrain him, could only watch as he smiled and released the switch, mechanism activating with soft hiss, marking the beginning of their end. Brennan had cockpit door sealed. CBRN protocol. Chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear isolation. Feature built for this scenario, though scenarios existed mostly in planning documents. The seal activated when sensors detected airborne contaminants, locking him away in pressurized environment, pulling air from external sources. It saved his life. It also meant he couldn't open the door, couldn't access cargo bay, couldn't help men dying 3 feet behind him. He could see them through reinforced window, could watch as they realized what was happening, understood this was how they died. Not in combat, but from trap no training could prepare them for. They tried emergency breathing apparatus, but neurotoxin worked faster than reaction time. Within 90 seconds, the first operator began convulsing. Within 3 minutes, all 7 were on the floor, bodies moving in ways human bodies shouldn't, blood coming from places it shouldn't. The asset went last, his own device killing him with his targets. Brennan flew. What else could he do? Couldn't land. Couldn't open cockpit. Couldn't acknowledge what happened without revealing operations that officially didn't exist. So he flew. Maintained heading. Burned fuel reserves that shouldn't have been sufficient. Pushed his helicopter through speeds and altitudes violating performance specs, but which physics allowed because falling wasn't an option. He tried making contact. Every secure channel. Emergency frequencies. Command networks. Direct satellite links. Every attempt received, same automated response indicating no such operation in progress, no such flight plan existed. No such aircraft currently operating in any acknowledged theater. They'd erased him before takeoff, standard black operations protocol, but implemented with completeness, suggesting whoever authorized this mission knew it was compromised. He was already gone from official records, flying a helicopter that didn't exist on mission that never happened. Carrying dead men whose families would receive condolence letters about training accidents in forever classified locations. 11 hours, 43 minutes. That's how long he flew with cargo bay full of bodies, watching through window as they cooled and stiffened, as chemical residue dissipated until sensors indicated cockpit unsealing was safe. He never opened that door, never checked for survivors, though he knew there couldn't be any. Just flew toward the only destination his exhausted mind could conjure, a place where maybe someone would listen. He reached U.S. airspace, somewhere over Atlantic. Unauthorized entry, no flight plan, no transponder code. Flying on fumes and willpower and autopilot systems, military aircraft, possessed for situations when human pilots could no longer maintain conscious control. Automated systems brought him home while he sat staring at nothing, mind fractured by what he'd witnessed and been powerless to prevent. By landing at Sentinel Ridge, he'd been awake 30-plus hours, flown farther than aircraft should manage, carried cargo that would haunt him forever. The words stopped. Brennan sat motionless, emptied of story consuming him from inside. Cross and Kessler sat equally still, processing what they'd heard, understanding they'd become participants in something with unpredictable consequences. Recording equipment had documented everything, creating evidence that would either result in investigations or simply disappear into classification levels exceeding their clearances. Cross reached for her phone, made a call to an unlisted number. Conversation lasted under a minute. When she disconnected, her expression carried weight of decisions made above her authority. Brennan would be taken. Not arrested. Just taken to facilities where appropriately cleared people would document his story again, verify what could be verified, make decisions about what happened next. The helicopter would be processed. Every surface tested. Every system analyzed. Then destroyed. 7 operators would remain missing. Families would grieve losses never fully explained. The mission that never happened would continue not happening in official records. 3 hours later, vehicles arrived. Men in civilian clothes with military bearing walked Brennan out. He went without resistance, shoulders carrying weight of 7 deaths, and silence following him for life. The helicopter was removed. Tower logs corrected to show normal operations. Security personnel who'd been on duty received transfers to different installations. Sentinel Ridge returned to routine obscurity with no record of unmarked helicopters landing with 1 pilot and 7 ghosts. Cross stood on flight line watching convoy disappear toward horizon, understanding she'd witnessed something remaining classified long after retirement. Kessler deleted interrogation recordings per orders from so high up that questioning wasn't an option. Tolliver edited radar logs until showing nothing unusual. And somewhere in nameless facility, Captain Jax Brennan began debriefing, determining whether he spent 6 months in psychiatric evaluation or career in meaningless desk jobs where nothing interesting ever happened and questions were discouraged. Truth lived in spaces between official narratives, in memories of people who couldn't speak what they knew, in files requiring 3 authorization codes and never accessed by anyone with authority to act. Maybe that was real punishment, not erasure, but remembering only in ways that couldn't acknowledge full horror, reducing 7 deaths to statistical anomalies and 1 survivor to cautionary tale about operations pushing too far into gray spaces where national interests and moral clarity stopped being distinguishable from each other. Some missions don't end when you land. Some keep flying, circling in dark places of memory, waiting for clearance that will never come, for homecoming that doesn't exist, for truth that will remain classified long after everyone who knows it has died. And somewhere, in a facility with no name, Brennan sits at desk facing wall. He files reports about nothing, answers emails that don't matter, lives life bearing no resemblance to the one he had before. But sometimes, in space between sleeping and waking, he's back in that cockpit, hands on controls, 7 men behind him, flying toward dawn that never quite arrives. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to Real Hero Stories YouTube and like for more Real Hero Stories YouTube.